participants. Yeah, so I'm just waiting for, I'm hoping that Bruce isn't having trouble.
Fragile commodity. Um, you can think about a shelf life of an orange. Um, it can easily go away. And ethics and the process by which we reach ethical decisions is not a new idea. I mean, we have ancient philosophers and others who have helped us to understand it. But now, to your point, I think, Margarita, we have computer scientists and data scientists that are both uh, causing great impacts on our lives, the social dilemma and the great hack illustrating those. But they also have the opportunity with AI and ML to monitor for ethical reasoning or unethical conduct. You have banks obviously looking at fraud that way, and governments. So ethics, as I teach it at Stanford, is the place between the floor and the ceiling. And on the floor are all the sidewalk cracks that if you touch them, you get a different career, you go to jail, you get a fine. And then on the ceiling are the ethical ideals, the things that get you a TED Talk for a Nobel Prize, that you've conducted yourself at the highest level of your profession. And so there are codes of conduct that people frankly don't know exist, and I can take us through a little bit of those, that probably are at least a consolidation of the knowledge about ethics for a given profession, whether it's bioengineering or mathematics or otherwise. So that's why.
Yeah, absolutely. Shatu, when you and I have had a number of conversations, and I've had you on a podcast just talking about um, ethics and values, and especially when it comes to design and innovation. Uh, and in Silicon Valley, we're so, well, one, we're so Silicon Valley centric, right? We think we're the bee's knees, but we're very Western centric as well. As an African woman, and you look at these models, what's missing and how can it be different, especially when we start looking at inclusion, capitalism, post-colonial thinking? What are the issues that come up that people may not be aware of because they're too inside the system?
Maybe first of all, I would also like to answer a question when you asked why ethics, why now? When I look at AI ethics, for instance, the narratives are dominated by, we have more negative narratives being shown to us in the media, or problems of existing technology. For instance, you would see headlines saying Twitter is racist, or algorithmic harm, or facial recognition software not recognizing people with dark and brown faces. And these kind of narratives show that there's something missing, or that there's something wrong. And especially when it comes to AI bias, there's this idea that machines are excluding certain parts of the population. But then when you look at AI ethics, even within the ethics community, between data scientists and AI ethicists, they don't even have a common definition of what bias means. Because the common definition of bias is, for instance, that one part of the population is disproportionately favored, and this can be assigned a product. The end product could be then prejudice or unfairness. Whereas if you look at statistics, they have a slightly different definition, where a statistical bias is when there's an unfair sampling of the population, or when the estimation process hasn't been very accurate. However, like you said, as an African woman or as a BIPOC, I think it's important to realize that data is never neutral, that it is a product of many factors coming from historical context, and it's not just the data that is causing problems, but it is the people who are developing these codes. Because what is implicit in this idea of bias is that the algorithms learn whatever patterns the creator of the data presents. So in other words, AI bias is a mirror of the prejudices of the people who are creating those algorithms. So I think this is a real problem that needs to be highlighted. And looking at AI ethics in particular, we see also that there's been a lot of unintended uses. So I'm a peace advisor, so I've been looking at how AI technology has been exploited as a tactic of asymmetric warfare, for instance, and how facial recognition software is being used to repress and surveil on a mass scale. So these are, from a civil society perspective, also problems that should be looked at. The way tech companies inadvertently contribute to the conflict dynamics. While these software developers are usually based relatively insulated somewhere in the US or in Western Europe. So
So
yeah, I
one of
think
the yeah, and you've covered a lot, Aisha, too. And I know, Stephen, you and I talked because we were both engineers by training and reflecting on how engineering curriculum is so filled with engineering that when you get room for an elective, it's another engineering course or it's another technical course, right? But yet and still, how do we integrate? You're in an organization and you're in a sector that is very regulated. How does you as an engineer, how do you see ethics seen in practice?
Cool. Thank you, Margarita, and thanks for having me. I do want to say that in practice, it's really joining a company that represents your values and represents values of safety and the values of putting the customer first. And working for a life sciences company, the customer is generally, is first. For example, on Gilead Sciences website, on Gilead.com, they have published that the vision of Gilead is to create a better and healthier world for all people. The mission is to discover, develop, and deliver innovative therapeutics for people with life-threatening diseases. And as a software developer in a company like this, I know that the code I'm developing, the code and the systems I'm engineering are ultimately feeding into research that will eventually go towards helping all types of people that really need life-saving medicine. So when it comes to, and I can attribute some of this to just electives I've taken and books and coursework that kind of stress this. I think in engineering, there is the concept of, I think there is safety and there is sort of like wiggle room, and tolerances, and I sort of apply that to sort of just things I do every day. They're and lucky for the life sciences, or unlucky, is that there is a lot of regulatory oversight, especially when it comes to human safety, and I think a lot of that can be traced back to different events in history that led to these safeguards that were put in place. So in the life sciences, in the life sciences, there are kind of like guidelines and rules that are kind of set that one has to follow when working in this type of industry.
Yeah, so you're always operating within an ethical and safety protocol and framework, and that bounds what you do. So it's almost like the default is that you're going to operate in this way because it's a regulated environment. There are things that you need to comply with. So there are these guardrails for you that are just built in terms of how you work.
Exactly, and and the core values that Gilead does publish as well is integrity, doing what's right, inclusion, encouraging diversity, teamwork, working together, accountability, taking personal responsibility, and excellence, bringing your best. So it's up to well, it's not up to the employee, but a good employee, I think, will take these core values and apply it to the work. And having the core values of integrity, inclusion, teamwork, accountability, and excellence. That works as my kind of ethical framework, and sort of, making sure that when I'm doing my work, it's the best work I put forward, that it also includes everyone in my company, or it includes the people that need to be seeing the data or seeing whatever I'm doing, just in a way that helps promote innovation and progress and safety.
Yeah. So Bruce, codes of conduct. And we were talking about this the other day, and how different professions have codes of conduct. And I was struck by our questionnaire how people didn't have an ethical framework. And I thought, well, surely they must have a code of conduct. But it seemed to me like there might be this gap between the code of conduct in the profession and then people in their occupations not realizing that their occupation might actually have a professional code of conduct that resides outside of the organization. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, and I was really taken by, if I'm mispronouncing your name, I apologize, Aisha. Aishatu's comments. Look, and Stephen talked about an institutional code of conduct or ethics code. That's great. But an institution such as Gilead or a bank is made up of thousands of individuals who bring different talents to the organization. You could have accountants, you could have bankers, you could have doctors, you could have lawyers, you could have everybody, and engineers. And it turns out that each of those professions, the very reason they were hired, carry a code of conduct. And that code of conduct stays within their entire career, whether they go to Gilead, whether they go to Bank of America, whether they go to an investment fund, it doesn't matter. They don't put on a new suit of ethics separate from their profession. Even when they leave the profession, they still have that. Now, so you have, Margarita, an overlapping or even a confluence of multiple codes of conduct from each professional, discipline, then wrapped by an institutional framework. So as a lawyer, you only have to prove three things for a malpractice case, at least in the United States with our common law. You need to prove, was there a duty? Was it violated? And were there damages? So if I sue someone at an institution and they say, I didn't know I had a code of conduct, I've already proved that they had a duty and they broke it by not knowing they had it. And now the question is damages. So what I think we're coming to is, on this panel, is that the world is as complex as it is, which means we all bring our best game every day from our professional and our engineering or other school training. And with that came a code of conduct in each of those disciplines that was optimized for better behavior within the profession, no matter how the professional skill was used. And now that confluence is what we need to be talking about, not because a chief ethics officer of an organization pronounced the ethics, but because the very skills you were hired to bring were imbued with those ethics in terms of how you would deploy them for social benefit.
So often when I'm working on this peace engineering effort, we talk about ethics and safety, and this phrase is like safe and ethical deployment of emerging technologies, because it seems like we have this like Groundhog Day conversation of there's a new technology and ethics is either overlooked or not really dealt with, and then it's put out into the market, it creates this harm. It's like, oh my gosh, I had no idea it was going to do this. And then and then we forget, and then the next generation of innovators come up and they put out this thing that's going to move fast and break things and disrupt markets, and they go, oh my gosh, I had no idea. And we go through this over and over and over again. um, how do we get off of that treadmill of it's almost like, if you don't know history, it just it just repeats itself, right? And I see that you've got this code of conduct. Let's talk to me about
Yeah,
this.
I just, so this week in class, I talked about the codes of conduct, knowing that we were going to speak to that. So here is one slide of the 2018 version of the ACM, Association of Computer Professionals Code of Conduct, and you're seeing a recognition within the profession that it has a great impact on the world. And the same would be said for the data scientists or the mathematicians or the statisticians, professional societies' codes of conduct. And so I just think a little bit of curiosity, as I did for class, and I don't mean to do it here. I said, let's take 2 minutes and go find the code of conduct for the profession or the skill area that you practice or want to practice. And in 2 minutes, they came back with all the codes of conduct in the chat. And I think it's an exercise in seeing how simple it is to find that there is a code of conduct as a compass setting for ethics, but how bizarre, as your survey showed, that professionals might not know they even had a code of conduct, and they're waiting for an ethics officer in their company to declare what their ethics should be.
Yeah, absolutely. The when we look at the things that came up in terms of burning questions in the questionnaire, the topics around inclusion, equity, predatory capitalism, extractive capitalism is an issue. So when we talk about ethics, it's a very broad canvas. There is, I was talking to a colleague of mine in Asia who works in the energy industry, and he was talking about how in Singapore, they do not assume that everyone comes in with the same moral compass or with a moral compass at all in their company. It's a multinational. But what they do is they train everyone, because the burning question is, who is your master? Right? And you ask someone, who is your master? Who is it that you ultimately answer to? Is it your religion? Is it, your company? Is it your country? Is it, who is it that you answer to? And they try to normalize that and say, like, in this organization, we have compliance standards. It's not only the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law as well. And they do such extensive training because they have people from many different countries and many different religious heritages as well. You can't assume that everyone's coming, say, from a Judeo-Christian tradition. They normalize and say, this is how we operate, and this is how we always operate. And it's really in the DNA of the culture. They really push it in. So it's not just a poster on the wall in the break room, right? How do we do that? How do we get from a slogan or a mission statement like don't be evil to something that actually is something that you do, that is in the DNA of how you operate in your culture? How do we get there? Because then it's not one of like, oh, I forgot my ethics. I got to go. Let me go Google that.
So Margarita and I strongly want to hear from the other panelists. Absolutely. In banking, I have the luxury of picking up the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and seeing a bank fine in the neighborhood of $1 billion every 3 days. So I don't have to reach very far to find an ethical hypothetical of a banker doing the wrong thing. It's every few days. There is a large, embarrassing fine from somebody not thinking through in a feedback loop of how does what I'm doing short term affect the reputational value of my institution long term. So it's very
So,
easy for bankers to find the problem.
so is ethics just a positive externality? It's sort of like clean air. It's like, well, we don't invest in it, we don't really think about it, and so if the air is polluted or not, well, that's somebody else's problem. If I cause harm, is ethics sort of like a positive externality that no one focuses on? It's like, oh, it's a nice to have, and not really understanding the cost of ethical lapses or
So
harm.
here's where, and I will be quiet because I know the others have great examples too. Thinking about creating finance for space, for outer space, and I'm building a commodities exchange for space commodities. Imagine Matt Damon not being able to get back from Mars because somebody thought it would be more to their benefit not to perform a water or an energy contract to give him the energy or water to get back. I mean, trust, and it gets really existential up and out there. And it is so here too, terrestrially. So
Yeah.
as a positive or negative externality, if a market cannot trust the counterparty to perform the contract, whether it's delivering food aid or whatever, this is really bad. And it gets bad really fast. So we need the ethical norms for every trust vector that we can.
Shatu, what do you see
Yeah.
in your world on this? I can see that I see the wheels thinking and the wheels turning.
Yeah, my wheels were turning because I think one really important question that needs to be asked is whose ethics are we talking about? Because ethical considerations are mostly dominated by Western theories. And the thinking behind AI ethics, in my opinion, needs to include traditional thinking systems of different cultures, whether it is from the Asian culture or whether it's from African or indigenous. And that we should start acknowledging that because there are so many vast regions that we should include other traditions in our thinking. Maybe they can show us a different way of medicating bias or dealing with the unintended consequences. So, for instance, Western ethics are dominated by this idea of deontology and utilitarianism. And when I talk about deontology, that means it's really a focus on this idea of reason and logic. And utilitarianism looks more at seeking the greatest good for the greatest number of people. However, if you look at all the different traditions that exist in the world, you can find actually that there are certain principles or norms or values that you can find throughout all traditions. For instance, honesty, truthfulness, compassion, and altruism are really the kind of norms or values that you can find throughout that are of importance. And the commodity of trust that Bruce mentioned is really important. That's why in many guidelines or frameworks in AI ethics, you'll find that one of the highest principles is explainability and transparency, because those two can contribute towards creating trust. And if you have a company and you have an AI system or product or service that you can explain to others, that would create trust. And if you have an AI product that is transparent and you're totally transparent with your customer base, you are creating also trust. And this, in turn, when you are creating products that are increasing trust, you are also at the same time caring for all stakeholders. So not only the customers that you have aimed these products for, but you're taking care of the lawyers that don't have to, look for to protect the company from potential lawsuits. You protect all those stakeholders that you maybe didn't have in mind that could be potential customers, and you're caring. So for me, designing AI products is designing about something that you care about. And if you show that you have explainability and transparency as one of your main principles, that will really be something of value that can increase your revenue in the end. So you do something good, and at the same time, you increase the connections that you have with all the stakeholders. And I believe also that we shouldn't only look at the human needs, but if we develop something, that it should be ecocentric. And with that, I mean, we should try and develop things that have also the needs of nature in mind and the environment, and also the needs of future generations that aren't with us yet, but which are affected by our decisions. So I'm very inspired by traditions of indigenous traditions or African traditions. For instance, there's this African philosophy or ethical philosophy called Ubuntu, and it's a South African tradition, and it focuses on the idea of the individual. Ubuntu means the bond that is that binds us all as humans together in a single whole. So it sees humanity as a single unit and atomic individual persons as part of this unit. And that changes the way that we interact with our environment. Whereas dominant Western theories, they emphasize individualism. If you know this famous philosopher Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am, the consequence of this kind of statement is that you have a subject-object relationship where you're building walls against one another. So I believe that we can learn a lot from other traditions, and that there's a need for cross-cultural exchange so that we can learn from each other. So this is just
Yeah,
something I wanted to
I
share.
was very struck by moving from being egocentric or human-centric to ecocentric. We don't think a lot about the moral or ethical, there are organizations like PETA in terms of abuse of animals, but we don't think about abuse of the environment. And certainly in legal structures with Citizens United, corporations have more rights than people, than humans. And even in the Supreme Court, we're still defining what is human, who gets full rights, much less animals and plants and the rest of the planet. And so when we talk about ethics, again, it's a big topic. So do we scope it in terms of like ethics across society, ethics in terms of commerce, ethics in terms of technology, ethics around innovation, there's safety, even in a large company, what you need to cover is so broad. And I was looking at the codes of conduct that Bruce surfaced, and it was interesting because they do address issues like social justice, diversity, inclusion, environment, climate change, sustainability, all the things that we really actually care about are covered in these codes of conduct. And so I think what was interesting is that you see, in terms of Black Lives Matter protests, and then companies are, kind of looking internally, like, what do we need to do? And it's like, the codes are already out there. So it's not, so again, I'm struck by this huge disconnect between what's written and what actually gets on to people on the ground. How do you operationalize this? How do you do this on a day-to-day basis?
So when I hear about Ubuntu, and again, I mispronounce things because I'm from Philadelphia, the notion that each person is an atom bringing their physics of conduct from their code of conduct into connection with other atoms to make molecules and the rest. And Stephen can correct me on my bio here. But suffice it to say that we don't talk about our codes of conduct, first of all, if we don't know they exist, to your point, Margarita. but also we don't see the combinations of them and the possibilities of the combinations of actually fulfilling their highest calling as something we're doing day to day in our jobs, in our institutions. We just don't see it, and we see it as a negative issue, as a avoiding of fine or penalty or embarrassment. I think we have to see both, and we can use AI to be sensitive to both possibilities in real time.
What struck me,
I wanted to add something to what
yes,
Bruce
please.
said. Before you were talking about this idea of duty of care. And you can find this actually also in principles that are used in humanitarian assistance or peace building, which is called do no harm or conflict sensibility, whereby you have a duty of care for the populations that you affect. And it defines a standard, of how you're supposed to conduct yourself and to try and prevent harm, knowing that you will cause harm at some point. So I believe that maybe one big problem, but one thing that you mentioned as well was the fact that I don't think that people don't forget the ethics. I think that it is strongly connected to this idea of if I do something wrong, I will be punished. If I even, if someone might even accuse me of thinking that I might do something wrong, I will be punished. So, and this will have legal ramifications. And I think, especially in the US, you can be sued for anything. Someone slips in your doorstep, and then someone could sue you. Because if they can prove that you had even the intention or you didn't really do anything to protect this person from slipping, they have a cause. So I think people are just scared to admit that they do something wrong because that will cause punishment. So what we need maybe is to create a brave space where people can admit they do something wrong so that they can learn from it, so that everyone can learn from it. And then also to acknowledge that if you make yourself vulnerable and you admit you do something wrong, that creates trust. If you try to hide that you do something wrong, because if you produce something, there will always be someone using it in a way that you didn't intend. Like social media being used by radical groups to recruit others. This isn't the intention of social media, but it's happening. So we need to maybe look at ways how it can be safe to do a mistake and learn from it, and how we can maybe create a kind of system where we are sharing the mistakes that we make, so everyone can learn.
Yeah. So Aishata, you're saying something really important there, and I know that, for those of us who work in the peace space, making a small plug for peace, there's the negative piece and then there's the positive peace space. And the negative piece is keeping people from doing bad things, and it's very punishment oriented. Or, positive piece, on the other hand, as Bruce was saying, that's the ceiling. How do we celebrate and create incentives for people? In our lab, in our institute, we say, our motto or research question is, how good can we be to each other? And ethics is a powerful tool for us to be good to each other. And, what does that look like in a practical standpoint? If I'm a business, how good can I be to my customer? How good can I be to my stakeholders, to my vendors, to my supply chain? That to me sounds like there's no upper limit to how good you can be. And that provides opportunities for innovation, opportunities for service design, for customer experience, all of this. And so if you look at ethics as actually an opportunity space rather than something that's problematic, we could generate so much energy and actually begin to create the world that we actually all want to live in by embracing ethics and saying, how do we use that as a North Star of I want to be better. I want to improve. And having a process of, again, sharing the mistakes, so that way, and I should tell you, we're really big on collective intelligence. We want people to innovate in a coordinated manner, so we could all learn very quickly. Don't do that. It's like, okay, got it. Everybody else, don't do that. Okay, and this works, great, let's all do that instead, right? And how do we create that collaborative, um, supportive learning culture in business, in innovation, in tech? I'd love to hear from Stephen. As a researcher, as an engineer, how do you think about these things? And there's a question for you also in the Q&A from Melissa, asking what does inclusiveness look like in the context of software development?
Thank you. So in software development, that's a hard question. I do feel like because I'm not working in, I haven't worked in direct like software, like consumer software, consumer tech in maybe 7 years. However, I can speak on diversity and inclusion in general. I'm someone who grew up in an area where, I was lucky enough to grow up in California, where there were people who looked like anyone and who came from all different backgrounds. I myself, I have a heritage and I have a background that might not be the same as the person sitting next to me at work or in high school or in college. And I think, inclusion means listening to everyone who has a seat where you are, and even people who aren't able to have the position where you are, and hearing them out and championing their insight in a way that can add to company culture, add to your own culture, and add to your own beliefs. And that's how I take it. And I think in California, for the most part, we're lucky that a lot of companies and a lot of individuals, I believe, share my feeling towards what inclusion means. And it's very easy to be someone who practices that. So in software development, I know that, well, I don't know, but it seems like there's a reputation of it being sort of not so much what I described, but it might be. I mean, I've been sort of insulated away from that what I think most people consider big tech or consumer tech for quite some time. But I think as long as you surround yourself with good people and try to help other people who want to do likewise, inclusion can look like what I described.
Yeah. So, Stephen, life sciences has, when I was in venture, life sciences had a lot of women in it, and it was interesting in terms of a STEM field. They were like, okay, we can't get women in computer science, but tons of women go into life sciences. So it does better than tech in terms of gender diversity. Bruce, so I know we have all sorts of questions in the Q&A, so I'm gonna look at, there are questions about codes of conduct. Amanda writes, codes of conduct are useful guidelines, but how is adherence and compliance assessed? Likewise, how are the actual values tested and revised as necessary? Surely a code is a starting point. There are a ton of unknowns to be surfaced. Isn't a code a process and a mindset?
Yes, 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 and yes. In preparing this week's lecture for the class on codes of conduct, I actually went back and revised the slide deck that I've used illustrating the codes of conduct. And I was surprised to see, to Amanda's point, that the software engineers code of conduct from 2015 had been updated in 3 years, 2018, to a computer professionals code of conduct. So both the scope of professional activities that they were defining the code for, and the ways in which it should be practiced have been way expanded, like tripled. And that's the evolutionary nature of all codes of conduct. As a lawyer, we have many pages, and I wanted to get back, I think, to Aishadu's and your point, which is there are in the law, we have what are called DRs, disciplinary rules, and ECs, ethical considerations. And those define for lawyers the really bad things you shouldn't do and the really great things you should aspire to do. And lawyers have been around, and they're not saints by any stretch of the imagination, but they've been around arguing with each other for many hundreds of years about what was and was not proper conduct and how you would lose your license to practice law. So I think each of the professions, in the complexity of the digital world that we're living in, the peace world that certainly you lead thought on, will develop a range of disciplinary activities and for reinforcement and enforcement, and then ethical considerations, illustrations of how the profession contributed to an unlikely good outcome.
Great, thank you. So I'm looking at the other questions. And yeah, so Michael Barden writes, positive peace is a laudable collective goal. Add to it the 17 Sustainability Development Goals articulated by the UN. And maybe that ethics is a behavioral demonstration of a universal societal goal, striving to achieve positive peace. Every code of conduct should be seen as how you link to the societal goal. And by the way, Michael is not a ringer. I don't know Michael Barden, but that's a great comment. And I was, you know, and Bruce, to your point on your conversation about codes of conduct, I'm having my interns go and scour the web. And by the way, call to action for all of you who are listening. So if you have a professional code of conduct, if you do, send us the link, and we'll have a follow-up in the email on that. Because I was curious to see how we could create a matrix of these codes of conduct of all these professions. Like, what do they say about diversity, inclusion, the environment, you know, all these things. And then how do they line up with the SDGs, right? I'm curious to see that, because if we start thinking about this again in sort of a comprehensive system, and providing that within design and innovation frameworks like design thinking or a business model canvas or anything like that, and you overlay that, and you can always be mindful, because one of the tensions certainly that we saw in the questionnaire was, you know, this push to profits, and I thought, well, there's return on investment, but there's also return on integrity. And people see, and it's this very curious place that we're in right now, that people think that if you're ethical, you won't be profitable, as if the only kinds of companies that are profitable are unethical companies. And if you stop and unpack that, that's kind of ridiculous. They were all gangsters.
Historically, with the colonial period in high relief here, that was true.
Yeah.
It was true
So we can change
in
that.
traditional economies, but I think we can change it. And the other point I think you hit on, Margarita, is no profession can claim to do good without looking to a separate profession to quantify how good it was. Just think it through. You would not be able to show the benefits of technology as a technologist. You would have to go to a farmer to ask how many additional, you know, mouths were fed, for example, or to the medical profession to ask how low did the infection rate go because of this technology. So each profession, even in being ethical, would rely on another profession to quantify what that really means. So the convergence that the matrix you're talking about might be is an interesting alliance of values.
So I do have to mention, I'm going to ask all of you the things that you want people to learn, change, and do as a result of this webinar. In terms of learning, Bruce, what do you want people to do to learn?
Be curious and find the codes or code of conduct that your profession or skill requires you to know and practice.
Right, and Aishatu.
I would like people to learn to practice awareness of unconscious bias and power dynamics that influence the development of AI. And I want people to learn from non-Western approaches how we can make AI better.
And in terms of change, what would you like to see that people change as a result of listening to this conversation? Bruce.
But I think the confluence of ethics is a really intriguing complexity for the world that we really haven't leveraged. We've been battling whose religion is right or whose governance structure is right, and it's the confluence that actually is the most intriguing to me, and how to automate those confluences so that they happen with regularity, quantitatively.
Great. And Aishatu, in terms of what people should change.
When I look at companies, for instance, I would give them the advice to avoid monocultures within their teams, tasked with designing AI, and that it would be really important to prioritize diverse backgrounds. Because only if you have people from different kind of backgrounds in your company designing AI, you can actually have some kind of safeguards, people looking out for developing something that they would also want to be part of.
To do, what should we have people do? Calls to action. Bruce, you have, I see that you've got something here.
Oh, close your eyes for a second and think about being up in space on Mars. And what are the ethics that you would want people interacting with you, and how you would interact with the planet? And I take us to space because it is, like a mural, a whiteboard without any markings, without any predispositions. And you need it to work, because it gets really existential really fast, and people die really fast up there if they're not collaborating ethically.
Yeah, and Aishatu.
Maybe I would like people to do a similar exercise, to close their eyes, to imagine someone from 7 generations in the future sitting next to you, and then for each decision that you make, to consider that person.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful. Stephen.
So I'm going to try to answer all 3 questions. Call to action, I really do suggest, maybe if you haven't done so in a while, reach out to someone, or reach out to someone who works in the field that is not quite what you do. So sort of like what I'm doing right here. Think about a topic you haven't thought of in a while, and reach out, maybe have a conversation, just to share your perspective and hear different perspectives, and sort of refresh and sort of just promote self-growth as a result of it. And I hope people can start doing that after this conversation. For change, again, I think a lot of people do this, but if you haven't done so in a while, sort of like what Bruce and Aishatu were saying, kind of whatever situation you find yourself in, new or existing, try to go in there with a blank slate, just see, okay, like my preconceived self would do this, but what would I do as of today, as of this moment? Would I do things differently, knowing what I know today, or knowing what I know from the conversation I just had with Margarita, Bruce, Aishatu, and Stephen. And sorry, I forgot the first question. But I think those two answers
do. Fantastic.
Okay.
So I'm looking at all the questions, and a lot of them are statements. There's really good stuff here. So we're going to do more of this, and what we've got, this was a big deal for me, and I've been wanting to develop something that would help people. And so what we've been working on is developing a workshop called Return on Integrity, why an ethical business is a more profitable one. And we'll be doing this the week of October 26th. It will be live and interactive, and it's for executives, entrepreneurs, and industry leaders. So it's not a webinar, it's not a talking heads, but we're really going to dig into this issue of how you develop your own ethical framework, the kinds of questions you should ask, and how do you operationalize it? Because to me, what I'm really passionate about is, how do we make ethics real? How do we make ethics something that is a living practice in your culture? And especially with emerging tech, AI, machine learning, whatever the next thing is going to be, these questions are going to come up again and again. And so how do we think about ethics at the point of innovation, at the point of product development, at the point of starting your company? So that way ethics is in the DNA of your culture and in the DNA of your practice. And I would love to work with a group of you on figuring that out. So if you're interested, we will be communicating with you on that. Because I think that the time has come of not thinking of ethics as an afterthought, as we saw in the questionnaire. Half of you didn't have anything. And it's quite fine for all of us to watch the Netflix documentary and clutch our pearls and tut tut and say bad people them. It's sort of like there for the grace of God. It blew up for these companies and they didn't see it coming. It could easily blow up for any of us if we're not vigilant, if we're not proactive about putting these safeguards in place and having these everyday conversations, and also flipping the script and saying, how can we use ethics as a superpower in our design and our innovation, so that way the thing that we want to put out in the world actually has the impact that we want. And I think if we can frame it that way, ethics isn't going to be something that we avoid or something uncomfortable, but it's something that we can embrace. And with that, thank you, Bruce, Stephen, and Aishatu for this lively conversation. And I've enjoyed reading the chat as well. I can see that all of you are really into this topic. Hasta la próxima, as we say. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aishatu.